Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, it's good to be back in the Senate. Like a number of my colleagues, after dodging the virus for 2 years, it finally caught up with me last weekend. I spent a week in quarantine and fortunately experienced only mild symptoms. I think that's because I was fully vaccinated and boosted, and I was glad to have the help of modern science on my side. Well, there's never a good time to be away from our work here in the Senate, but we all have a responsibility to keep those around us safe as well, no matter how inconvenient. Unfortunately, there are reports that our friends across the aisle may be intentionally disregarding that responsibility. I'm deeply concerned by published reports that our Democratic colleagues have adopted a don't test, don't tell policy to ensure full attendance today. Allegedly, they're more concerned about ramming through Senator Manchin's tax hike than following CDC guidelines to protect not only each other, but the staff members, the Capitol Police, custodial staff, food service workers, and countless others who keep this institution running. These folks could have any number of other health conditions that could lead to more severe COVID experiences than, for example, I had. Or they could be caregivers for young children or elderly relatives who have a high risk of serious illness. I sincerely hope these reports are not true. I hope our Democratic colleagues are not selfish enough to put so many people at risk in order to pass this massive tax and spending spree. So if any of our colleagues are experiencing COVID symptoms, they should do what I did. They should get tested, period. We know that as soon as this evening, the Senate's expected to vote on Senator Manchin's and Senator Schumer's massive tax hike on middle-class families. You could call it the Manchin-Schumer tax hike of 2022. It sprung to life unbeknownst, I believe, to virtually all the Democratic senators except for Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer. And no one has seen what we will purportedly be voting on later today, even our Democratic colleagues. No one has seen the final product once the so-called bird bath has been undertaken by the parliamentarian. This will be a substitute bill that Senator Schumer will lay down, but nobody's seen it. When the senior senator from West Virginia announced this bill last week, or this agreement, every Republican was shocked, and from my view, most Democrats were as well. My private conversations with many of my Democratic colleagues said, boy, that does not look good, to be working so closely together on a bipartisan bill only to spring this on everybody by surprise. Looks like they were trying to pull a fast one. After all, Senator Manchin had put the kibosh on reckless tax and spending spree bill last year, and he doubled down on his opposition just a few weeks ago. And privately, his Democratic colleagues assured me that this was not happening. But then the senator from West Virginia has engaged in a gigantic, Olympic-worthy flip-flop. Senator Manchin will tell you this bill is completely different from Build Back Broke, but it's not. And we should take a look at some of the elements of this legislation. Build Back Broke was a roundup of expensive, unnecessary, damaging policies. It included job-killing tax hikes, which would leave hardworking American families without a way to earn a paycheck. Green New Deal climate policies that would hurt our energy security and drive energy costs through the roof. Taxpayer subsidies for wealthy people buying expensive cars and SUVs. I was listening to the Majority Whip, the senator from Illinois, talking about these businesses that are making too much money, and so they need to pay more in taxes. Now, that's a what I've come to expect from our Democratic colleagues. They're kind of a Robin Hood party, take from the rich, give to the poor, except here, this is a reverse Robin Hood. They're taking from middle-class families who can't afford to buy expensive electric vehicles and giving a tax subsidy to wealthy people who can afford to buy them but are helped with a $7,500 taxpayer subsidy. So you might call that a reverse Robin Hood. Then they want to supersize the Internal Revenue Service with even more manpower and authority to track everyday American people and perform, I presume, many, many more audits, not just on the rich and famous, but also on middle-class Americans. And then there are the special handouts to powerful friends of the Democratic Party. This isn't the type of legislation that will bring our economy roaring back to life or cool inflation. In fact, that is the first place that this bill is misrepresented. To call it an Inflation Reduction Act when nobody believes in the near term it's going to have a single impact at all on inflation. That's what Penn Wharton said for the next 2 years. They said it may actually make inflation worse, but it's a negligible amount. But the one thing we're sure of is it sure won't go down. So it's not an Inflation Reduction Act. It's really an insult to the intelligence of the American people to think that you can spend this money and you can tax individuals and businesses during a recession, something everybody from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama to Chuck Schumer to Joe Manchin has said you don't do, which is raise taxes during a recession. But that's exactly what this bill does. Higher taxes, bigger government, more inflation, and fewer jobs. This is a bill whose time has not come. No wonder when this bill was originally proposed as Build Back Better, Senator Manchin opposed the bill. So let's see what he and Senator Schumer wrote in secret behind closed doors and then sprung on the American people. And again, we haven't even seen the final product yet. And yet Senator Schumer said we're going to stay in session until it passes. Well, it's going to have to take all 50 votes of Democratic senators and the vote of the vice president to do that, because not one single senator on this side of the aisle was consulted, was asked to work on a bipartisan basis to come up with a product that could be supported across the aisle. This will be a purely partisan exercise. After, I think we've had a pretty good run of bipartisan cooperation, and I've been proud to be part of that. But this is a complete reversal of sort of the spirit of bipartisan cooperation that we've seen, frankly, all summer long, which has produced some pretty good legislation. Well, they're tax hikes that will leave hardworking Americans poorer. Not only will inflation be roughly 9%, which it is today, meaning that for every $100 you earn, you're only going to get $91 in purchasing power. In addition to that, the Joint Committee on Taxation said the impact of this bill will mean that individuals earning as little as $10,000 a year will see an increase in their tax burden, because you can't spend this much money, you can't tax this many people without it having some trickle-down effect on taxpayers, certainly those who earn less than $400,000, which was President Biden's pledge. And I heard the majority leader say that again, and I believe the majority whip too, but it's just not true. The Joint Committee on Taxation is the entity here, nonpartisan entity which provides the final word on those issues. So notwithstanding the denials of the majority leader and the majority whip and others, the Joint Committee on Taxation said that Taxpayers earning as little as $10,000 will see their taxes go up. Maybe not their income tax, but they'll be poorer as a result of this bill. Again, and part of that is because you'll be taking, in addition to inflation, in addition to additional tax burden, you're going to be asking them to pay taxes to subsidize wealthy people to buy electric vehicles, or to subsidize people's health insurance, even though they make well above the 400% of poverty cap that was initially part of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. That cap has now been lifted as well. We'll see what the final product looks like, but the earlier provisions show that people earning up to as much as 750% of poverty would then receive taxpayer subsidies for their health insurance. Well, Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer may have slapped a new name on Build Back Better or Build Back Broke, but all of the essential elements are still there. Tax hikes on families, the Green New Deal, massive electric vehicle subsidies. Oh, and here's another thing. A lot of the American car manufacturers said, we may not be able to access these tax credits because 70% of the components that go into electric vehicles are made in other countries like China. That's how slapdash this bill was put together. If more time, more deliberation, more debate, more bipartisanship had occurred, maybe we could have come up with something that would make more sense. But this is what happens when you get in a big hurry. You make mistakes and do things that make zero sense, like provide this subsidy to a limited class of car manufacturers when 70% of the components of a typical electric vehicle, including the battery, come from overseas. As I said, this is a misleading labeled bill. It's not going to do a thing to ease inflation in the near term. The budget experts at Penn Wharton analyzed Senator Manchin's tax hike and bill and completely decimated the argument that this legislation will reduce inflation. If this bill becomes law, inflation will not get any better anytime soon. In fact, I believe Americans can expect it to get worse. The people at Penn Wharton said the Manchin tax hike bill would increase inflation slightly in the short term and cause it to stick around for 2 more years before it would have any impact. That's what you're going to tell hardworking American families. You're being priced out of your favorite food and grocery products at the grocery store, or you can't afford to fill up your car. Just wait 2 more years. Well, if the Democrats are successful in passing this bill with purely Democratic votes, there will be an accounting. And there will be a comparison by voters in November with, okay, they told us if we pass this bill, it would reduce inflation, and let's see what inflation looks like in November of 2022. I'm not wishing for higher inflation. I hope inflation will go down, but this is exactly the opposite of what you ought to do if you want to reduce inflation, to restore people's purchasing power. Well, again, several years ago and more recently, our colleague from West Virginia said he didn't think it was wise to raise taxes during a recession. He and the majority leader have tried to convince anyone who will listen, who is gullible enough, to believe that this bill does not raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. But as I said, the Joint Committee on Taxation explodes that myth. Next year, more than 60% of taxpayers who earn between $40,000 and $50,000 a year will be hit with a higher tax bill. That's what the Joint Committee on Taxation said. It's in the so-called distributional tables. It's a pretty complex calculation, but that's why we rely on the Joint Committee on Taxation to provide this expert information and guidance to us, because frankly, it's beyond the capability of most of us in Congress. They also said more than 90% of those earning between $75,000 and $100,000 a year will pay more in taxes, and a whopping 97% of those earning between $100,000 and $200,000 will see a tax increase. I heard our colleague, the Majority Whip, talk about these big, rich companies, oil and gas companies, pharmaceutical companies, making too much money. But these aren't billion-dollar corporations that they're raising taxes on. These are middle-class families. And for what? To subsidize rich people driving around fancy electric vehicles? It's a disgrace. Well, of course, working families aren't the only ones going to face a higher tax bill. The Manchin tax hike also hits businesses, and it's sure to have a devastating impact on, guess where? West Virginia. I'm not making this up. Higher taxes require companies to cut costs everywhere. I think sometimes our Democratic colleagues have this idea that if you raise taxes on businesses, they will simply absorb it and they won't pass it along to their customers. That's a flight of fantasy. Higher taxes will require them either to pass those costs along or to cut costs elsewhere, like to cut off their employees, to not hire as many people as they would otherwise hire. And I was flabbergasted, frankly, when I saw that according to the Tax Foundation, the industry that will be hit hardest is the coal industry. Now, we know the coal industry has been the primary target of Democrats' green policies, and maybe that's what they have in mind, to put even more coal miners out of a job. Despite the adverse impact this legislation will have on families and communities across the country, it was written by two people, Senators Manchin and Schumer. They've been working hard since they announced their deal, arrived at in secret behind closed doors. They've worked hard to try to get this bill to the floor to see if it complies with the Senate rules. And they continue to make last-minute changes going on even as I speak, which is the reason none of us have seen the final product. But we're unlikely to see those final changes before Senator Schumer asks us to vote on the bill. But still, Senator Schumer said he expects every Democrat to fall in line and to vote for this legislation within a matter of hours. They haven't seen the bill either. I have to imagine that Democrats in both the House and the Senate are pretty unhappy with this process. Experts have analyzed this bill and said it raises taxes on families. It'll have an adverse impact on jobs and keep inflation high, certainly not cut it. But the top Senate Democrat expects his colleagues to ignore these warning signs and to vote for it anyway. Like I said, Madam President, all of us are held accountable by the voters at election time. And I guess ultimately that's what this exercise will be about. It'll be about political accountability. On average, there's been about 40 amendments to a so-called vote-a-rama, which we're all familiar with, which we'll experience presumably later on tonight, where our colleagues said, well, there may be some amendments I would like to vote for, but I'm going to vote against them because I want to make sure we get this bill across the floor, no matter how ugly the process, no matter what's in it. Well, Democrats have tried and failed to convince the American people that the biggest problems facing our country aren't really problems at all, or certainly their problem. Despite all the obvious warnings, the Biden administration officials insisted that inflation was transitory. It's temporary, won't last long. And now they even want to redefine what it means to be in a recession. even though we've experienced 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP, gross domestic product growth, which is the textbook definition of a recession. People in my state and across the country know better than to believe this sort of sleight of hand. Despite what our colleagues are saying today, this bill will increase taxes on families earning less than $400,000 a year. It will stifle medical and pharmaceutical innovation and prevent new life-saving cures from being discovered. It will threaten our economy and our energy security at a vulnerable moment when we're in a recession. And it won't do a darn thing to ease the loss of purchasing power due to historically high inflation rates, the highest in 40 years that consumers and all Americans are experiencing. Won't do a thing. No amount of spin or fast talking can conceal the damage this bill will inflict on the American people. Senator Manchin likes to say, if I can't go back home and explain it, I can't vote for it. But for the life of me, I don't know how our Democratic colleagues are going to explain this one in November. I yield the floor.
Well, nobody's gotten to the bottom of 9/11, unfortunately, and they should have. Well, nobody's gotten to the bottom of 9/11, unfortunately, and they should have. Well, nobody's gotten to the bottom of 9/11, unfortunately, and they should have. Well, nobody's gotten to the bottom of 9/11, unfortunately, and they should have. Well, nobody's gotten to the bottom of 9/11, unfortunately, and they should have.